Well, good evening, everyone. I think we will get underway. Still a few people joining us, but time to start. My name is Mike Galsworthy, and I am the chair of the European Movement in Scotland. Welcome to all of you joining this webinar this evening, the latest in our series. And we're delighted that we have tonight as a speaker, Mike Galsworthy, who described as a leading commentator on the impacts of Brexit, which indeed he is, and much more besides, one of the leading campaigners on Brexit, against Brexit, and on pro-EU activities generally. So commentator doesn't really give him enough of credit, much more than that. His particular background, of course, is that he founded in 2015 the group Scientists for EU and has been particularly vocal critic of the impact that Brexit has had on science in the UK. Mike took his degree in natural sciences at Cambridge. Thereafter, he did a PhD in behaviour genetics and then moved into science policy and health policy, and that gave him perhaps the foundation for his work, campaigning work for Scientists for the EU. And also, I'm very pleased, as this is a European Movement meeting, that Mike has joined the European Movement UK as a campaign strategy advisor, helping to plan our national campaigns in the bid to rejoin the EU. European Movement in Scotland, we're an independent organisation, but we work closely with the European Movement in UK as our sister organisation, with whom we also act as the Scottish end of that movement. So we're really keen to hear from you tonight, Mike, and we're glad you could be with us. The format today is that it will be a webinar format, which means there won't be a live Q&A with everyone chipping in and having a say, because the numbers won't really allow that, but we'll certainly have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end of Mike's talk. So what you should do if you want to ask a question or make a comment is use the Q&A box. You'll see the icon on your screen. I'm sure most of you who use Zoom will now be used to that, but put your questions and answers in there. I will moderate the questions along with Mike as they come in. I will certainly try and get as many questions to Mike as possible. And with those opening remarks, welcome, Mike, and over to you.
Hi, good evening all, and thanks ever so much for coming along and listening to me mouth off about what I like to mouth off about. So I'll talk for about half an hour about science and Brexit and what Brexit has done to science. But then there's the main idea is that we engage in sort of questions and answers and just chat, not just on science and Brexit, but also where we are now on the various dimensions of the pro-European drive community, and also what the strategy is of European movement at the moment and how we're looking to build back. So without further ado, let me try and get you up to speed on what's going on with regard to science and what Brexit has done to it, and therefore what we need to do in order to salvage what we've got. And I think the best way to do this is to take you through chronologically from the referendum right through to the Brexit wars of 2016 to 2019, then Brexit itself, and then where we stand now and what it looks like going forward. What actually have we lost out on, and how do we know this? So starting with when Scientists for EU set up in May 2015, we actually didn't know at that stage, when we founded this campaign on the day that David Cameron won the election on a promise of holding a referendum on our membership of the EU, we didn't know what proportion of the science community was actually for remaining. It was something that hadn't really been brought up as much of an issue actually within the science community, even though we knew amongst our peers, and this was in Scientists for Labour, that we all thought that it would be a hell of a bad idea. So when we set up that campaign, in May 2015, it took off like the blazes, but then there were also some other bits and pieces of polling done by various science-related entities that quickly found out that about 90% of the science community was for Remain. And actually, by the time we came around to the referendum itself, that was on a par with the higher education sector as a whole, the creative industry, and also the tech industry. So all of the UK's cutting edge in terms of thought and innovation was overwhelmingly pro-Remain. And within the science community, we organized, various letters of the great and the good, explaining why collaboration on the European level was added value to all. We had the brightest man on the planet at the time, Stephen Hawking, may the universe rest his soul, saying that Brexit would be a disaster for science. And out of the 200 odd universities across the UK, there was not one vice chancellor that wanted to back leave. And so it was quite an extraordinary position from the science community that we were all very much pro-Remain. And we didn't know how the referendum would pan out, much like our colleagues at Britain Stronger in Europe. We predicted a degree of doom and destruction should we vote for Brexit, not on the broad economic levels that the Stronger In campaign did, and they were very, very narrow like that, but rather in terms of our place in the whole collaborative network that we had helped develop and what that would mean going forward and how that would really pull our teeth. So as we came up to the actual vote in 2016, I wrote two plans, one for what we'd do if the vote was for Remain, and one for what we'd do if the vote was for Leave. Now, one of those plans was really exciting and fun, but unfortunately, I had to invoke the other plan. Had we voted Remain, then we would have actually had the president's role of the EU in 2017, where we could have done a lot with open data, just like the Dutch had been leading us up on that. We could have also done a lot with regard to the balance between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in science. There was a ton of options that we could have got on top of. But given that it was a vote to leave, my business plan for that is that essentially we had to document the damage being done in order to alert the politicians to how serious the impact was, and we knew it would be serious. And then secondly, make the sensible recommendations for how we at least maintain the basic fabric of collaboration over the next chaotic years. So enacting that plan, the first thing that I had to do was say, right, we've just voted to leave, what's the impact been? And Scientists for EU, we were first out of the traps on this because we had a big followership at that time. And so we just put out surveys. And what we found was, in terms of Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020, the grant program we were on, there was tons of chaos because people didn't know what the future was going to be on that. And so UK partners were stepping out of consortium applications so that they didn't jeopardize it. There were also some European partners asking UK partners to step down in leadership roles or step out of it. And you had other European partners saying, whatever you do, don't leave this consortium, we want to keep you. So it was really, really quite chaotic in terms of lots of readjustments on the Horizon 2020 program. We also had many cases of people who had been offered a job in the UK who then cancelled it on account of the vote, thinking, right, that's Britain screwed, and also I philosophically object to where this country is going. we had a lot of academics say that because of the vote, they intended to leave the UK. That was only intention for the vast majority of them. There were a few that had been offered things and decided to pick it up on that basis. There was also, because of the fall in pound, contracts frozen and purchases frozen, because the cost of the equipment to be got in now had shot up beyond budget. And so there was also, in some cases, new employments frozen on that basis. So what you saw was, from the get-go, a sudden paralysis in many places, not all, of course, but it certainly kicked in overnight, that there were readjustments both in the private sector and the public sector as to what the vote meant. And it was detrimental. It was universally detrimental. I think the BBC reported at the time, someone in a lab saying, overnight, UK science has suddenly gone from being cool to being definitely not cool. And so then the question was, how does the government deal with this? You know, is it just a blip that they can reassure the science community about, or is it something that was going to be corrosive over the next years? Now, Theresa May, as soon as she came in, despite her really strong language about many other aspects, she highlighted science as one of the areas where they wanted to invest heavily, and also maintain our full collaborations with the EU framework. So that should have gone a long way in order to make sure that we didn't drop off on the European science programme. Unfortunately, Theresa May had first up as her Brexit minister David Davis, and then I believe we moved on to Dominic Raab. I don't know if I'm missing anyone, but the themes coming out of the very Brexit ministers under Theresa May was very much along the lines of, no deal is better than a bad deal, therefore there could be no deal at any moment. And at Scientists for EU, we calculated what a no-deal Brexit would mean. And that would mean that we would suddenly be out of the EU science programme. We could participate in it as a third country status. But what that would mean was that about 45% of our funding lines that we were currently winning, we would no longer be eligible for. So the European Research Council grants, the Mary Skłodowska-Curie grants, and a couple of other very minor grants. And that meant that out of the 1.2 billion quid that we were getting per annum on the science programme, we would lose out on about 45% of that, i.e. £500 million a year. If there was a no-deal Brexit, suddenly we'd be down to £500 million a year. And that's everything else remaining equal. And this threat of a no-deal Brexit kept ticking over. And there were some other threats associated with it as well, because if you're suddenly out of the EU science programme and you don't have an associated status on it, then you can't coordinate projects either. And this was something that was disputed between the UK government and the Commission. And it was something that never got resolved, and so was hanging over us all the way from 2016 through to 2020. And basically, all of this had a huge chilling effect on the programme. The long and short of it meaning that by the time we got to 2021 and Horizon 2020 had completed, we had missed out on some £1.5 billion of funds. So tens of thousands of collaborations, with 30% lower than what we should have been at over that time period. And to put it in the big context is from the science programme FP7 starting in 2014 all the way through, Britain and Germany had been in pole position all the way from 2004 all the way to 2016. Who was ahead? Germany, no, the UK. the UK, no, Germany, the UK. But then when we got to 2017, we fell significantly behind Germany. 2018 behind Germany and France. 2019 behind Germany, France, and Spain. 2020 behind Germany, France, Spain, and Italy in 5th place, just above the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is a small country. And so that's where we were in 2020, absolutely stepping down the rungs on the EU science program. And it's not just the fact that we had helped shape this program and helped drive it and had been in pole position with Germany, but when it came to actually playing the coordinator role on a lot of this, it'd been absolutely predominantly UK institutions that had led it. So that means that we go into Horizon Europe from a 5th place starting point rather than 1st place. But that's, should everything be cool and dandy, and as I will come on to a bit, that is not the situation because of Article 16 and the Northern Irish Protocol, which means that we haven't actually started Horizon Europe yet fully, whereas the rest of the EU countries and associated countries have. But let's park that up and say, what other damage happened to UK science other than our participation on the science program, which is an important part, but it certainly isn't the only thing. So first of all, there's the European Medicines Agency, and Boris Johnson can wax lyrical as much as he likes about it was because we left the EMA that we could have the vaccine rollout that we did, which is not just wrong, but misses a massive thing about the dynamic of the UK with the EMA. When we were in the EU, the European Medicines Agency was based in London. There were about 900 very well paid jobs associated with that, because we were doing the approvals for the whole single market of medicines, which is second only in the world to America. We've got a larger population. The Americans consume a lot more drugs though. But anyway, the single market for medicines, we were running that from London, all the approvals of it, all the different parts of it. MHRA and the EMA were the twin engines on sorting everything to do with that. And it had tens of thousands of business visits per annum. The overall turnover was over 300 million quid, taxable as well. And there was attendant industry set up around it. We were running that show. Now, when we voted for Brexit, David Davis thought that we could retain the approval body of the EU for the single market of medicines, which is woefully naive. And it went off to Amsterdam, and they got all of that business. And we lost all that power and prestige and tax money and talent and industry around it, which is desperately frustrating, given that we are such a powerful life sciences country. But then there were also things that went with it, like rare disease networks, funding for orphan drugs, and a bunch of other medical stuff. Also, by the fact that we left that single market for medicines, which the industry begged the UK not to do, it means that regardless of the COVID vaccine, we are just now a smaller market than the EU market, which means that novel drugs will get tested out in the EU market preferentially to the UK market. And if you don't think that's serious, well, let's look at what our government did, which is our approval body for medicines in the UK, the MHRA, that did so well on approving our coronavirus vaccine quickly. Well, our government just took 300 jobs away from it, stripped it down, shrunk it, after saying how fantastic it was. Why is this? Because it's now the approval body for a much smaller market. So it doesn't have nearly as much custom and business as it used to when it was in team conjunction with the EMA. Is this not ridiculous that just about a year ago, Boris Johnson was saying, we left the EMA, we've got our MHRA, which is so much better. And then sneakily, they had to reduce the size of our excellent medicines approval agency because we just don't have the volume of business need as we did before when we were in the EU. Also, thanks to the Brexiteer mentality, we shrunk down on our overseas development aid budget, which meant that we got lots of our contracts with bodies around the world, research bodies around the world, cancelled, including those on COVID in Brazil, looking for new variants. We had Tesla and Intel announce that they were leaving or weren't going to set up in the UK. They were preferentially going to set up in the EU because of Brexit. We have, of course, had our Erasmus scheme pulled, and that has had a really detrimental effect on bringing some of the best and brightest into our universities here. Similarly, with free movement, that has knocked on to universities, making a huge impact of seeing a 41% decrease of some of the European talent coming into our universities, which in England we haven't addressed. In Scotland you have, actually, with the Saltier grants, which was a good move by your government. But then there are also other effects as well from the broader science and technology environment, which is, firstly, with Galileo, we were stripped out of that program, having developed a lot for that satellite system. We are at risk of losing our place on Copernicus as well. And our place also in ITER, which is the nuclear fusion center in southern France. Well, when we Brexited, we decided not to leave that global entity and then come back as an individual country. To make things easier, we joined it as a sort of adjunct through Euratom. And so if things go wrong on Article 16, then our role in ITER as well could be jeopardized. And then on top of that, we left the European Investment Bank, which has funded a hell of a lot of the innovations in the UK, and also the Regional Development Fund, whereby our government has put in new programs that only add a small amount relative to what the EU was investing, predominantly in science and technology and infrastructure. So what we see then in summary to date is a lot of damage across the board, from our universities to our university exchanges, to our collaboration potential, to big businesses coming here, to our foothold in the regulatory environment in which our businesses operate. And all of this hurts a lot. And what makes things worse at the moment is the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the fact that that isn't resolved. Because that isn't resolved, we have been formally accepted on Horizon Europe, the next collaborative science program, and with it, our role on Copernicus and some roles on Galileo and Euratom. But until Article 16, the Northern Ireland Protocol gets resolved, we're not actually stamped and signed on that yet. And so we're waiting. And one of the things that's happening at the moment is this is getting kicked along. This can is getting kicked along. The rest of Europe, and that's the EU countries and the associate member countries that buy in, they've all started on Horizon Europe. Some UK institutions have, under certain lines, started, and our government has had to fund them instead of the EU because we're not fully on board. But a lot of other institutions and teams are simply missing out on the first year, on the first 1.5 years now, of grants on Horizon Europe, as we wait to see what happens with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And if you're wondering why I have not made more of a fuss about this, or the UK science community has not made more of a fuss about this, or EU scientists have not made more of a fuss about this, it's because we're kind of having to lie a bit low on the issue, take the hit and lie low. Reason is this: when David Frost was negotiator, he said, oh, this delay means that we're losing out on a whole load of money on the EU science program. We should pull that money and invest it in our own national program which replicates a lot of the parts of this. Now, obviously, that's mad, because you can't, from a single national funding source, replicate a multinational funding system that includes the funding input of lots of other countries. So it was mad. And George Freeman, the science minister, had to go along with it because they had to posture. And so the fear is, in the UK science community and in people in the commission who care, is that if we make a big fuss about this and point out how much money British scientists are losing at the moment, then that could trigger the Brexiteers like Bill Cash, who's highlighted this before, and David Frost, who's still a big mouth, into saying, right, well, let's pull out of that then and just go for a national funding scheme. And so the hope is that Northern Ireland Protocol issue will resolve in the sensible collaborative way of just accepting, largely with some tweaks, what the current situation is, rather than the full ripping up of the contract or invoking Article 16 or what have you. But as this goes on, the more months that go on, there's more and more bleed in this. And there's a couple of other dimensions that I want to mention to Brexit and science. One is Dominic Cummings's input and his grab of national science funds and pushing it into ARIA, which is a badly designed program, which just goes to show that this government hasn't been consulting with the science community in how best to invest in science. And the other is TIGA, which is the Task Force on Innovation and Growth Regulation, that our government is looking to seize the benefits of Brexit by pulling away from the EU in terms of how we do a lot of regulation. And it hasn't come up with any goods or anything particularly smart, but this government is trying to prove the benefits of Brexit in the domain of science by trying to have different, looser regulatory frameworks. So in summary, on top of the damage being done and the current bleed that is undergoing, we also have a government that, because of its Brexity mindset and wishing to prove it, is actually not listening to the UK science community and is rather pushing some of its own stubborn, determined political ideas onto UK science in order to try and prove Brexit. And that's actually doing damage to the natural evolution of UK science. What we really need to do, and this is my concluding remark before we go into general questions, is we need to ensure that we stay on the EU science programme, and we need to ensure that we have a collaborative outlook with regard to climate change, innovation, science, standards, human health and healthcare. All of that set is something where we need to get back in the driving seat of Europe, because Europe is the best in the world in this rounded, healthy package of how you approach science. And that is why the drive of European movement, it can be aimed in the direction of rejoin, but there are so many gems along the way that help regather the UK's position as an intellectual and creative driving force in Europe, to the benefit of the UK, to the benefit of Europe, and ultimately to the benefit of the world. And that's my driving force about how we call this thing called Brexit an experiment. We did an experiment. We've learned from it. It's okay to experiment, but learn from it. And now let's get back to that extremely privileged position we were in, whereby we could benefit ourselves and Europe and the world. And that's what I want us to be doing in science, because at the moment it's hurting. Thank you.
Thank you much indeed, Mike, and a lot to get us thinking there. And we have a few questions ready in the Q&A. But can I just ask one question myself, just a clarity about the link between signing up for the Horizon Europe program and the Article 16 protocol? Is there some kind of actual organizational link, or is it that the UK won't sign up until it's decided whether or not to go along the protocol, or whether it's going to start causing problems? What's the linkage?
So that is an excellent question. Basically, the UK wants in. Absolutely, its preference is to be in, and that's what we agreed in the TCA, in our trade deal with the EU. The point is that with the science program, we used to design it, we used to co-own it, and as such, we couldn't be booted out. When Brexit came along, we gave up our rights to design it, we gave up our co-ownership of it, and we could be booted out of it at the EU's whim at any point. So the EU can absolutely, and this has always been the threat, use the science program as a political football should it wish. So this was one of the things in the trade agreement that the EU reserved the right to do if there were disagreements on things such as fishing. You know, they reserve the right to pull the plug on the science program, for example, because they know the value of the science program to the UK. The UK is a leading science nation that had been driving this. But is it just realpolitik like that, and them being bastards, because they can be bastards? Partly, but also there is a fundamental thing about the agreement that was done with the trade and cooperation agreement that means that the agreement with the science program sits on top of it. The first deal that we did with the EU was the withdrawal agreement. That was the oven-ready deal that Boris Johnson was pushing in 2019. That included the Northern Ireland Protocol, all of that. So that was the foundation. And when this foundation got set, agreeing the UK pays the EU a certain amount of money because it owes it that for all the different reasons, you know, the 39 billion. And also we agreed to these rules about, you know, Northern Ireland and how we're going to manage that and how we're going to manage our markets and the borders between them. That's all foundational stuff. And given those foundations were set in place, the rest of the trade and cooperation agreement was kind of like, all right, given that that's sorted, we can make these agreements on zero tariffs. We can make these agreements on collaboration with Euratom. We can make these agreements on the science programs. We can make these agreements on, you know, future on data flow back and forth, future agreements about citizens' rights back and forth, and so forth and so on. So if the UK government then goes back and says, you know, that foundational block that we put down, which was the withdrawal agreement for Northern Ireland Protocol, actually we could rip that up, then the EU is saying, well, if you take that away, then everything that follows it, that was based on it, that's not in secure waters anymore, because you don't honor agreements and you might not pay up for the science program. You might might not abide by contracts. You might not honor the legal decision making when there are disputes within the science programs. We don't know what you're going to do. So if you can't honor the foundations, then legitimately and legally, there is jeopardy for us here taking you on board with something that's based on top of that. So it's a bit of both. You can make the legal arguments, but also it was always understood that the EU have got something that we want, and that's membership of the science program. And if we're going to mess around on Northern Ireland, they've proven that they're quite willing to play hardball on science, and that's just the way it is.
Okay, thanks so much, Mike. That's very helpful indeed. Now let's turn to a Q&A, and I'll go through it with Mike, but also have a look yourself as we go through it in case I don't pick up any issues which we ought to. There's a couple of questions from Claire Morgan Davis, which I think maybe both go together really. But first, is there some government help plan for Horizon Europe funding if Article 16 is launched? I presume it means triggered That perhaps you maybe already answered that question actually. And the next one from Claire is, what about issues of data sharing in Horizon 2020, which is heavy on GDPR? Is it at risk of being trashed? Can you say anything about that for those questions?
Yes. So with the first one, it comes back to what do we do with the money if we can't buy in the EU science program, Horizon Europe? And one of the things that worried me from what David Frost and George Freeman said back at the end of last year was that they would put the money into the UK's own science program, which would replace a lot of these functions. So firstly, if we were formally out of the EU science program as an associate member, then that takes me back to what I said before. We wouldn't be able to participate in the European Research Council grants and hosting those, which was a major thing for us. Also with the Marie Curie grants and also with some innovation grants. However, for participation in Horizon Europe as third country status, so playing second fiddle when you can't coordinate a program, but you can just participate in it, we could do that. And our institutions would want to do that. And our government would have to pay for that. So it's not a case of if we can't buy into the EU, then we move all of this money to another thing. It's kind of like if we can't participate in the EU, then we still have to pay for our institutions doing half of the things of the third country status, and then half the money which we can't put in, we have to put onto a new program to try and replicate things like the ERC and the Marie Curie grants and innovation grants, and importantly, coordinating multinational grants. So because Frost and Freeman didn't phrase it as the latter, but rather, if we can't put our money here, then we're going to do our own thing, made me think that they hadn't really thought it through. The practical reality is that we would have to spend half of that money on still allowing our institutes to play second fiddle in a lot of participation roles and programs, but we would not be coordinating, we would not be hosting ERC, we would not be hosting Marie Curie, and so we would have to have probably an increased pot of money, not just half of it, we would have to put in more money in order to try and replace some of those functions. We could just about replace ERC and Marie Curie, inviting people over on big grants, but we would absolutely be missing out on coordinating multinational programs, because unless you want to fund all these other labs from other countries with your own national pot, the only way, and that would be very wasteful, you'd have to set up a new program that other countries want to buy into, and then you're just trying to copy the EU program and it doesn't work. So so there are backups, but the backups only cover everything except being able to coordinate big multinational programs. The second question about data flow, right? So this was something that wasn't fully resolved in the trade and cooperation agreement. So because it was rushed, the end point was that the EU will agree at the moment that the UK shows data adequacy for purposes of sharing data back and forth. And that goes for company transactions, but it also goes for, you know, sharing data between labs, sensitive data, maybe about individuals where you've collected clinical samples or what have you. That's a grace period. If we diverge from the way the EU does things with regard to GDPR, then that causes problems on a few fronts. For our tech innovators, for example, the free flow of data about who signs up to them between the UK and the EU, well, that's in jeopardy. So they would probably have to default to the EU system. When it comes to science and sharing data between labs, again, it means that your default option is going to be in the EU, in labs. That's where you want to store your data, because you know that that's going to be the European default. And it is risky to store sensitive data in a UK, under UK jurisdiction, if that's going to change going forward. So yes, it does throw things into jeopardy. And, you know, with regard to other standards around who holds what data and material between labs when you've got UK EU collaborations, think about DNA as well. So it's not just the bits and bytes of a database. It is also, if you've got sensitive biological material and the UK is diverging from privacy rules about that relative to the EU, then again, it means that the UK is not going to be the favored center for storage and analysis of sensitive information, which is just, yeah, unfortunate, but that's where we are. So that's an unknown going forward, because we don't know what the government's plans are on that, but it's something that makes a lot of people nervous.
Okay, sorry. Thanks, apologies, Mike, for that. A couple of questions which deal with whose employment effects on science of Brexit. The question at the bottom of the list is, do we know how many scientists have quit the UK because of Brexit or uncertainty over the horizon? And it was linked to that, perhaps, the question that earlier listened Thomas Starr Marshall, as someone about to finish their PhD, I'd like to know what impact you think Brexit will have on the availability of postdoc positions. Perhaps we could, your thoughts on those, Mike?
Okay, so we don't know how many people have left because of Brexit, or even how many have turned down jobs in the UK because of Brexit. As I said at the beginning of the talk, you know, we surveyed and got, I don't know if you'd call it anecdotal evidence, but exemplars of where that had happened. But it's very, very difficult to quantify. For example, when someone decides to take up a job in Harvard or Berlin, because in Harvard or Berlin, it's hard to know why they did that in a single explanatory reason. I think the number of people that decided to leave the UK purely because of Brexit, and so they did it in a sulk about that political issue, is probably very few. However, the number of people that might be nudged to take up a job in Paris rather than Nottingham, and one of the factors was looking forward at the funding landscapes and thinking that maybe we're not going to be in pole position on multinational programs in that area going forward, then it could be a factor. And so you just don't know what proportion of people it's going to be a tipping factor in, unless you start surveying everyone who has actually already left the UK. So it's one of those things that's extremely difficult to measure and quantify. Similarly, as I was saying, with people who have turned down jobs in the UK because of Brexit, we had examples of that right from the get-go when we were surveying that. And then over the next few years, different universities gave out examples of where we put out a job and usually it would be flooded with applications from the EU, but there were none. Now that's rare. Oftentimes people were saying, oh, it's a similar number to what we were getting before, but the quality isn't what it used to be. So again, how do you quantify that? It's really, really tricky. So so basically we can't tell on that front. We just can't tell. And that relates to the second question about postdoc opportunities, and I presume that meant postdoc opportunities in the UK.
Yeah.
What's a bit more quantifiable, if you were to really go about it, is the number of postdoc jobs being offered. And I don't think there's anyone I know that actually collects those numbers. And obviously you'd have to benchmark that against historical trends and against competitor countries and so forth and so on. So that's a harder one to pick up. And as I alluded to before, even if you've got the same number of opportunities opening over the next few years, how do you know you're getting in the best talent in order to fill them? You don't. And it may also be the case that as you lose funds on a national level going down the years, then you've got less postdoc opportunities opening up. Or maybe people have to skew their budgets to take on more PhD students because they're cheaper than postdocs. So again, these things are all interesting questions, but they're just incredibly difficult to quantify. So you can't.
Okay, now just dealing with some other questions. I think I see there's one on the top of the list, which was somebody who was raising an issue of problems with European settlement permits. Now that sounds to me as probably one you may not be able to say, but of a personal case, because obviously it's something we don't. Well, we shouldn't be talking about anyway. But any comments about the difficulties caused by the settlement scheme for science in particular?
Yeah. So this was a big thing early on, in that after Brexit happened, there was lots of confusion about what would happen to EU citizens in the UK. There had been promises from the Vote Leave campaign that, you know, everything would continue as before. But then you had early on David Davis saying that EU citizens in the UK were one of our best playing cards, i.e. a negotiation card. And then the issue of settled status and applying for it came up. And in order to get that settled status early, you had to fill in, I think it was a 76-page form. And if you made any mistakes on that, it was absolutely in jeopardy. There was a group of people who wrote in a book called In Limbo about lots of experiences of European citizens in the around this, and spouses of European citizens in the UK. And it did impact academics as well. I mean, I remember Mariana Mazzucato, the famous economist, having her settled status rejected because something had been misread that she wrote in terms of one of the numbers. And so the whole thing got rejected. And this caused a lot of trauma. Over a couple of years, the system got streamed down, and so it's a lot got fixed. But nevertheless, the tone of the whole Home Office handling of this, which included many examples of not just European academics, but also from further afield, getting booted out of the country in the years sort of like 2016 through to 2018. There are various examples of academics in UK universities being told that they had to leave. A lot of that soured the notion that the UK was accepting and supportive of foreign scientists and academics in this country. I don't know what the situation now is. My own two boys are on Slovene passports, so I've had to go through the settled status thing with them and their mother. That's all sorted, but certainly over the years, it's been a bumpy ride for many, and actually encouraged some people to leave. And I don't know how easy the system is to handle at the moment, but it certainly was not handled well. There is another issue on top of that, just to throw it in, about recognition of job qualifications. And that is something that the Rush Trade and Cooperation Agreement skimmed over in order to get things done quickly. And it left that as a big open wound that we don't currently recognize a lot of each other's qualifications, and this can be, across a variety of different sectors, and that is something that was meant to get patched in later. But because of things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, issues such as mutual recognitions of qualifications and data agreements and so forth and so on, a lot of things are hanging because we're not in a good place on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So you've got the issue of being accepted into the country and the settled status agreements, but then also you've got problems of the pragmatics of qualification recognitions, so that you can get that transfer of skills between the UK and the EU, and even things like ID cards now not being accepted in the UK to cross over the border with, has a lot of impact as well on people being able to just come over and visit for scientific conferences or on school trips and so forth and so on. So there's a few levels of snaring there, which just puts up barriers.
Okay, thanks, Mike. A question at the bottom of our list of Q&A, a different theme. What's your view on the Shared Prosperity Fund, or rather, how to be allocated that's purported to replace ERDF funding, and how do you think it'll affect research and innovation in the devolved nations of the UK? So I think there is a question there of, well, will the devolved nations perhaps lose out by the way it's allocated? Or what's your view on it?
Yeah, well, the devolved nations are already unhappy about the fact that the allocation of this money is decided at the Westminster level, rather than it being a pot that can be applied directly for at the devolved nations level, and even more refined levels. So you've got a few issues here. One is the amount, and the amount being given out nationally is less than what it was under the regional development funds. So much for the big notion of we pay 350 million a week into the EU. If we cancel this contract, we will be flush with more money ourselves to invest in the NHS, in science, and in regions, all of which was promised. But then the other issue is, as has just been highlighted, who decides where the money goes, for what purposes? And previously, it was, Liverpool or Cornwall or regional representatives making a pitch for the development of their region to a neutral, impartial body that just wanted to give out funds for infrastructure development, technological development, and so forth and so on. Now that money is being controlled by Westminster, so there is a big fear about pork barrel politics, whereby the government that wants to stay in power will allocate levelling up funds to those areas where it is advantageous for their political party to be investing those funds. And associated with that, there's another big difference between the European regional development funds and these new funds, and that is the European regional development funds are tried and tested and long-term and stable. So you can apply for fund after fund, grant after grant down the years without having to worry about short-term politicking of the current government in power, right? It's a clear purpose. It's only going to go for that purpose. And also it is long-term. You can plan on it. It's reliable. Whereas if you've got funds that are just given out by the current government in power, well, if the leadership changes or if the sentiment within the party changes, those funds could be here today and gone tomorrow because they've just changed their minds. So it's very hard to make long-term plans based on them because national governments tend to be a lot more short-termist in their outlooks. But if you're genuinely concerned about doing levelling up, that isn't a flash in the pan thing. That is it. That's a grind. And there are lots of other countries around Europe that have really, over a long period of time, engaged in that grind. And so the big fear is that by removing those solid, reliable, independent, long-term European funds and replacing them with flighty short-termist stuff, you're actually doing a lot to undermine what leveling up we did have.
Okay, now I want to come to a couple of questions which are more concerned perhaps with European movement campaigning. But before I do that, just one last question I may want to address briefly, which is related to science issues. What early indications are there of American commercial interests pushing for divergence on data standards?
Oh, good question. Well, I think we saw that with Facebook, didn't we? Where Facebook actually made a threat that if Europe did not allow Facebook to process European citizens' data in the US, then it would ditch Facebook across Europe. To which a lot of the European capital said, hurrah, that would really get rid of a massive populist problem for us and a thorn in our side. So there is certainly the dynamic that the big tech players largely want a much more data liberal environment than does the European environment, which wants a much more citizens first and precautionary principle approach to health and to data. And the UK is very much caught between the two, with the public naturally favouring the European model of protect us, first on health and on data. But our government is much more inclined towards the American model on both health and data. So that is something that is likely to play out a lot. And I think you will see it in companies like Facebook, but also importantly, in England, not in Scotland, but in England, our NHS is substantially more privatized. And I believe our government is looking for opportunities to ship out our NHS data to big US tech companies like Palantir, to process, analyze, come up with innovative solutions and sell it back to our government. So that is also going to get into the weeds of individual data privacy, particularly about health. So I do think there is that push-pull game that's going to be happening. Okay,
thanks, Michael. That's again a subject which I think we'll probably need to come back to in our webinars and campaigning as well. That has been a really great overview of what's been happening in the field of science post-Brexit and what's happening going forward. But as you hear also as the campaign strategy advisor for European movement, I think we'll close with the last two of the questions which concern very much the way that the European movement should be campaigning and what its strategy is. So we have two questions, perhaps you can deal with them together, but I'll read them out. The first one is that question: EMUK has a step-by-step approach to rejoining. That's rejoining the EU step-by-step. Wouldn't that just mean a Norwegian-style fax democracy, i.e. being a rule taker with no power influence over EU policy making? And then below it in the Q&A, a question which we all sometimes think about: as campaign strategy advisor, how can we get past the had enough talking about Brexit? I know it's stupid, but I don't really want to talk about Brexit, etc. syndrome. How do we keep the issue in the forefront? Oh, Mike, do you want to take your time, but close with a response to those two questions?
Yeah, so they're both very good questions. I mean, they're both like absolutely core questions. With the first one and the step-by-step approach, part of it is pragmatics, in that you can't say, let's have another referendum now to rejoin, because it wouldn't There's no appetite for it in the Conservative Party and Labour Party, which are predominant in the United Kingdom as a whole. I mean, obviously, if Scotland goes independent, you're in a different situation there. And also, the EU would be unlikely to let us in just because we voted to be in if we've got one of our two major parties that wants out, namely the Conservative Party. The EU at the moment do not want a country on its outer borders doing the hokey cokey, going in, out, shake it all about and wasting their time for ages. So it's not realistic that we just go diving for rejoin. I mean, we can say we want rejoin and we can track how many people do want rejoin and we can keep that social pressure building, but you've got to have the balance of the desire, but also winnable progress. And the two help keep each other alive. So we should absolutely be crowing about how Brexit is crap and how rejoin is better, but at the same time, think about how step by step you can actually start getting yourself into a better place. Now, as to the question, wouldn't that just leave us like Norway or Switzerland, somewhere stuck in the single market, but not a full EU member, and so therefore much impoverished relative to where we were before? Yeah, that there's a degree of risk of that, and I note that both Norway and Switzerland got stuck halfway into the EU and then couldn't get the referendums to get the final hurdle in. But remember, both Norway and Switzerland are smaller countries, and so they are happier playing by the rules of the big bloc next to them, with some permutations. Whereas I think we would want to be, fully in and having a say, and we would be able to wrangle, even if it wasn't full EU membership, and we're thinking about, a third pillar in the single market, EU, EFTA, and then a UK bloc, some joint say on how things are done. We don't know how things are going to evolve. We just know that we're setting a direction of what we want, and that direction is European spirit, European values, collaboration. Let's have more of it. Let's build together and work together, because we believe that's the right direction for humanity. And remember, when you start a chess game and you go, E4, E5, F3 or whatever, you're putting out your first pieces. You're not thinking about what the last moves of the game are. You've got no idea how things are going to evolve on the other side of the board. As you're making those moves, however, you're thinking about, how do I get into a structure whereby I'm starting to unleash the potential that I want to see play out in this game? How you're starting to get your favored pieces out, how you're starting to make progress. And there will be the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, depending on how things work out on the other side of the board. But you don't know what the end game is going to be, but you sure as hell just want to be making the most solid steps from the get-go. And so that's largely what you've got to do. You've got to get yourself into the best place possible and then seize opportunities that come along. So that's as to that part of the strategy. What was the other one? Sorry, I've forgotten the other one.
Well, how do we get people past the stage of, we didn't want to talk about Brexit, we're fed up with it?
Yes. So the step-by-step approach also factors into that. You can see step-by-step as a sequence, or you can see it as the whole Brexit EU thing smashed up into lots of pieces, scattered on the table, and we're saying, oh, we've got none of those now. Which ones do we want to regather? So instead of saying, let's talk about Brexit, because I mean, then everyone goes, oh. You've got to say things like, well, wouldn't you like us to be working with some of the other European countries on better ease of travel, and whether it be for our scientists or musicians or what have you. Don't you think we should collaborate a bit on security, given, you know, Ukraine and Russia and stuff, and sharing information? Don't you think that we should be working together on climate change? Don't you want to protect British European standards in food and farming? What about this issue of data? Let's talk about this issue of data, or let's talk about trade deals and Australian style farming and Brazilian style farming and American style farming with what we're doing in the UK and what we've been doing in Europe. And so a lot of what you can do is break down issues into away from the whole, you know, bundle package that was Brexit, and one by one work on those, because those issues are always going to be current. You know, if you're talking about how you manage democracy locally, nationally, and internationally, or you're talking about the cost of living and where we actually get our food from, or if you're talking about your children's health and who guarantees the protection of that, or if you're talking about the waterways, polluting our waterways, polluting our air, don't you miss the days when we could just take this straight to the European Court of Justice and our government was forced down? You know, there are so many different angles on this that we need to find the right angles for the right communities in order to win 100 little battles in order to get the few first steps done.
Okay, well, thanks, Mike. We're a little bit over time allocated, and I think the questions about the strategy for European movement, both in the UK, but it's got as an ongoing issue, and is one which we certainly return to and will develop with our members and supporters. What you're saying, I think, is really important for focusing those issues for us. I've just seen a couple of Q&A.
And part of doing what we want is ensuring that we've got a big enough community that we can do what we want. And that's why the memberships is so important. And that's why meetings and having more webinars and making the community more vibrant is important, because the more people you've got involved and the more people you've got bought in and the more structures that you've got built together, the more you can actually do the kind of things that you want as well. So that's a fundamental part of what European movement is doing.
Okay, well, there's already some QAs and comments on the chat taking the debate again, but I think we should leave it now, as it's now 10 past 9, unless you want to say anything else, Mike. Can I say I thought what you said today was really excellent, really got us thinking, and gives us opportunities of things to do, and a reminder of the damage that Brexit has done for Scotland and for the UK, and highlighting the various steps that we can take, whatever our views on the constitution, whatever position about Brexit is, and how we repair that damage. So it's been really a great discussion today, and we appreciate that.
And thanks for all the questions. And can I make a request? Because when I did one of these recently, the chairperson who had actually organized it sent me a whole bunch of feedback about what people had said in terms of what they found interesting, what they found novel, or questions that it triggered in them. So if any of you watching have any comments or questions or thoughts, please, I'm going to volunteer Mark to play the secretarial role here. He'll just gather them up and forward them on to me, because it's really, really useful to see that, because not everyone's got a chance to, ask questions, and some people are shy, but it's really useful to have that feedback. Okay, thanks very much. This is obviously one of a series of webinars. We've got quite a few coming up, and obviously quite a few campaigns as well. Look at our website for European Movement in Scotland for what's happening in Scotland. Obviously, if you're joining us from outside Scotland, look at the European Movement UK website and follow all our social media as well. I think what we've heard today, but also the world that we see outside what's happening in obviously in Ukraine, highlights so much the need for European unity, the need for
European cooperation, and it highlights for the need for us to continue to work what we're doing as organisations, and for all of us as individuals do what we can as well. If you aren't already a member of the European movement, you invite you to join up, support us and get involved in activities. Join up, just follow us on social media, keep up to date what we're doing if you don't actually want to join, but it's obviously important to join if you can. You will get at the end of this presentation, a slide will come up which will give you contact details and details of our website and the way to contact us, and you will get shortly after this webinar closes an email giving you contact details as well, so you can get involved in the future in what we're doing and support our activities. Our next webinar coming up shortly is on the French presidential elections. It'll be after that and looking at the outcome of the first stage of that, and that again will be, I think, in the email that you get after this webinar closes. If not, certainly have a look on our website and keep informed as well. So thanks so much, Dee, for taking part and joining us tonight. Thank you, Mike, that was great, and all the best to all of those who watched us this evening. Thank you.
Thanks. See you all.